This is Karen Zissis of ASCOA Online. Lately, U.S. military action in the Caribbean has been making headlines.
President Trump has announced a dramatic escalation in the U.S. military confrontation with Venezuela. He says the U.S. attacked a boat allegedly.
The U.S. military has again attacked a boat in the Caribbean, alleged to be carrying drugs from Venezuela, bound for the United States.
Over the course of September, the Trump administration carried out at least 3 strikes on alleged drug smuggling vessels it says were linked to Venezuelan criminal groups. Before that, in August, the United States deployed warships and 4,500 service members, including 2,200 Marines, to the South Caribbean to carry out operations against narco-trafficking. Venezuela has responded by dispatching thousands of its own troops to key coastal and border regions. But the military ramp-up in the region is about more than controlling organized crime. After all, for oil producers like Guyana, Washington's steps also mean protecting Caribbean shipping lanes moving oil, LNG, and other refined product to global markets. That's only become more evident since Venezuela stepped up its military presence on Guyana's border and escalated its long-standing claim on the oil-rich Essequibo region. In the Caribbean, energy and security go hand in hand. Understanding the region's energy landscape sheds light on why. And that brings us to the topic of this episode, in which we explore what the sector means to the Caribbean's future development. We take you from Guyana, once one of the region's poorest countries and now an energy powerhouse, to neighboring Suriname, a future producer. We cover lessons learned from the experience of Trinidad and Tobago, a regional energy pioneer, as well as how the collapse of Venezuela's Petrocaribe program has hit CARICOM countries.
I think in most scenarios, the oil in Guyana and in Suriname is going to be fully developed, even if there is a peak in oil demand. The current resources that they have discovered, I think, are going to be fully developed if nothing major happens in terms of a change in policy or something. That will be a very big deal for all these regions.
That's Francisco Monaldi, director of the Latin America Energy Program at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and a repeat guest on Latin American Focus. Dr. Monaldi spoke with my colleague Kalia Robertson, giving an expert assessment on the energy outlook in the Caribbean. But first, Guyana held elections in September, and even though President Irfan Ali won a comfortable majority, in the final months before the vote, an upstart political force capitalized on voter discontent to become the biggest opposition group in the country. So what's fueling that discontent in one of the world's fastest growing economies? I talked with Sarah Ann Lynch, former U.S. ambassador to Guyana, for insights into the country's political context and rags to riches story. Ambassador Lynch, who also served as a senior foreign policy advisor to U.S. Southern Command, covers the geostrategic importance of Guyana's ties with the United States, Venezuela, and China. Thank you for joining us, wherever you're tuning in, whether it be Seattle, San Juan, Seoul, or Sydney. We can't do it without you, our listeners, so don't forget to subscribe to and share Latin American Focus on Apple, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Ambassador Sarah Ann Lynch, it is such a pleasure to have you with us on Latin American Focus. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Karen. It's great to be with you here today.
So I want to start off by talking about Guyana's recent election. Now, you, of course, as ambassador, were in Guyana during the 2020 election, which was a highly contested election. It took a long time for those results to come out. This time around, we got the election results quickly, and within a few days, President Ali, who won re-election, was inaugurated. Now, there are a few things that we can look at in this context. Guyana obviously has exploded onto the international scene to become of huge importance geostrategically, thanks to this major oil discovery a decade ago that really propelled its economy to be the fastest growing in the world last year when GDP growth hit 43%. So, give us an overview of this year's election and why was the We Invest in Nationhood or the WIN party able to win this support despite this context in which President Ali had this huge economic growth?
That's a great question, Karen, because this all really goes right to the heart of Guyana's political uniqueness. So let's start off with President Ali's success in this recent high stakes election, which I attribute to two things. First, his party, the People's Progressive Party Civic, or the PPP for short, didn't just play to its traditional base, which is the Indo-Guyanese population.
Hmm.
They aggressively campaigned in areas that have historically been strongholds for the traditional opposition, the primarily Afro-Guyanese parties named under the APNU coalition. In particular, they went after votes in Region 4, the most populated region, which also contains the country's capital of Georgetown. And their approach paid off. Winning Region 4 was absolutely historic for the PPP and a signal that their message was resonating beyond their usual supporters. The second reason, the PPP delivered in its first term. President Ali's 2020 campaign pledge was all about using Guyana's immense oil wealth, more than 11 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, to build a better future for its citizens. And 5 years later, people could actually see the results. New roads, bridges, hotels, better health care. While there's still a ways to go in the country's development, in the end, voters chose the party that they felt was the best equipped to manage this tremendous transformation and put that oil money to work for them. Now, on the other side of the coin, you have the stunning rise, as you mentioned, of the WIN party. This wildcard party that was formed only months before the election by a business person who's currently sanctioned, by the way, by the U.S. Treasury for financial crimes, became the biggest surprise of the election. WIN leaders had no political experience, but they proved to be more politically savvy than expected. Their platform was simple: to break the cycle of the two traditional parties that have dominated Guyanese politics since independence. This approach resonated with young people, with marginalized communities who felt left behind by the oil boom. The WIN party also made a very smart play for the Amerindian vote, which has always been a crucial swing vote. So, Karen, nobody actually saw this coming. Analysts, including myself, expected the WIN party to maybe snag a few parliamentary seats, but WIN shocked everyone by securing 16 seats, which effectively dethrones the traditional opposition party, the APNU, the Afro-Guyanese Coalition, to become the new official opposition.
Now, I should disclose that I was very fortunate to get to host a program with you here at the Council of the Americas just before the election, in which we sort of previewed the election coming up. And one thing that came up in that conversation was a discussion about Guyana's diaspora. A figure that really stood out to me about this election is that the electorate is 800,000 people, and yet that's the same number of inhabitants in the country. And so the big reason for that is that Guyana has a huge diaspora. A large portion of this population left before the oil discoveries, of course. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that because now we're talking about a different scenario: massive economic growth, the infrastructure development that you've been talking about. And at the same time, this challenge that so much of the population's left, we're talking about an Amazonian country with a small population that has to meet huge infrastructure demands. How is Guyana meeting the human capital need that comes with this demand to build infrastructure?
That's the million-dollar question right now, Karen. So, the country's history of mass migration, when times were not so good, creates a really fascinating paradox. You've got a nation on the verge of becoming one of the wealthiest in the hemisphere, if not the globe, with a population smaller than a major U.S. city
Mhm.
and a massive skills gap. The government is tackling this with what I see as a three-pronged approach to human capital. First, they are training Guyanese. The government knows they can't simply import all the talent that they need, and they want to create jobs for their citizens. So they're investing in educational and technical programs, not just for the oil and gas sector, but for supporting industries like logistics, engineering, and finance, as well as other non energy sectors like agriculture, mining, tourism, and hospitality. You name the sector. Secondly, since it takes time to train a local workforce, the country is bringing in foreign experts and short term workers on a temporary basis. And crucially, they are expected to work alongside Guyanese to transfer their knowledge. Finally, the government is actively trying to entice the diaspora to contribute. As you mentioned, they represent a huge number and they are a huge pool of talent. In fact, there are more Guyanese living outside of Guyana than within its borders. It's
Wow.
really quite incredible. The Guyanese government, therefore, has put into place programs and incentives to encourage these individuals to return, to invest, or simply lend their expertise from abroad.
Great. We've been sort of looking domestically at Guyana, and I want to bring this into a bigger sphere because we've been talking about Guyana's growing geostrategic importance. The importance of its energy sector's potential has drawn this global interest. And a number of U.S. secretaries of state have visited in recent years, including recently Marco Rubio in March. So before Secretary Rubio even went to neighboring Mexico, the U.S.'s biggest trade partner, he went to Guyana. And so this tells us a lot about the way that the U.S. is looking at relations with Guyana. How would you characterize U.S. Guyana relations? Give us a view on that.
Historically, U.S. Guyana ties have been excellent due to strong regional, economic, and familial connections, that diaspora that we spoke of, for example. And the year 2020 was a key moment as Guyana was dealing with a fraught election. But once the new government was sworn in, and this was President Ali's first term, we first saw a visit from then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, the highest ranking U.S. official to ever visit the country. And then there were many more high level visits. In 2023, then Secretary of State Tony Blinken visited Guyana. And just this year, Secretary of State Marco Rubio did the same, as you mentioned. We've also seen a surge of interest from the U.S. private sector, backed by financial players. The U.S. Export Import Bank signed a $2 billion memorandum of understanding with Guyana, which unlocked favorable loans for U.S. companies to invest in Guyana. So I would say that both the frequency and seniority of these visits across U.S. administrations underscores a simple fact. The U.S. sees Guyana as a crucial partner in energy, in security, and in regional stability.
And I want to stop and talk for a moment about security in particular, because all of this is taking place in the context of territorial tensions between Guyana and Venezuela, and not to mention tensions between Washington and Caracas. There have been territorial disputes between Guyana and Venezuela that predated the oil discovery, long-standing disputes, but they have only increased since that oil discovery. And then, of course, we have seen an uptick in U.S. military activities in the Caribbean. We've had recent attacks on alleged Venezuelan drug vessels. And so I was surprised recently, given the close relations we've seen between Guyana and Washington, to note in some of the coverage that I read that President Ali has seemed a little bit lukewarm on the U.S. strikes on these alleged drug trafficking vessels. So I wanted to ask you, what balance is Guyana trying to strike in this three-way dynamic it has with the United States and Venezuela?
Well, a very timely question, Karin, of course. So I think when you look at U.S. Guyana security relations, you have to see them through two key lenses. One is the Guyana Venezuela border controversy that you mentioned, and then the broader issue of transnational crime in the region. So let's start with Venezuela. For over a century, Venezuela has claimed about 2/3 of Guyana's territory,
Well,
a region known as the Essequibo. Under Mr. Maduro, Venezuela has ramped up its rhetoric and its actions, particularly since major offshore oil discoveries were made in Guyana. This has put Guyana in a very difficult position, with a small military facing a much larger, more aggressive neighbor. This is where the U.S. comes in. The U.S. consistently reaffirms that it recognizes the border where it is, where it was established in 1899 by this international tribunal. We recognize that border until and unless another recognized, competent legal entity determines otherwise. So, therefore, the U.S. is closely tracking the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ's process, and expects a ruling on the border controversy in the near future. In the meantime, we continue to deepen our mill-to-mill partnership with Guyana, conducting important joint military exercises with the Guyana Defense Force. Now, for the second piece, security in the wider Caribbean. All Caribbean nations are facing a growing threat from transnational criminal organizations, which are involved in everything from gold and drug and arms trafficking to human smuggling. The recent U.S. military presence in the Caribbean is a direct response to this. So while some nations in the region have definitely been critical of this move, citing concerns about sovereignty, Guyana has actually welcomed the U.S.'s more assertive stance and this show of force. Guyana really sees this move as necessary, a necessary step to combat these criminal networks that threaten the stability of the entire region.
We've been focusing very much on the hemisphere and relations in the Americas. I'm curious, where does China and Chinese investment in Guyana fit into all of this?
China's influence in Guyana is definitely a fascinating and really a multi-layered story. You really can't talk about it without mentioning the long history of the Chinese people in Guyana. They originally came to Guyana, to British Guyana, as indentured laborers to work on the sugar plantations. This was in the mid 1800s. But more recently, China's interests have been changing, especially with Guyana's new oil well. For years, when Guyana was one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere, the country often had limited choices for infrastructure and for development partners. The People's Republic of China, the PRC, came in strong and usually won its bids on projects because they were the cheapest and, frankly, sometimes the only option. The PRC state owned enterprises have built roads, they've built bridges, and other key infrastructure. And of course, Guyana formally joined China's Belt and Road Initiative in 2018, which solidified this partnership. However, with billions of dollars in oil revenue, Guyana is now in a position of strength. The Guyanese have choices. It's no longer just about the cost of a project. We saw this play out in a big way with the country's flagship gas to energy project, the largest public infrastructure project in the nation's history. Despite strong competition from Chinese state-owned enterprises, the contract eventually went to a U.S. company. This decision signals a new direction in Guyana. Well, they will undoubtedly continue to have a relationship with China, which is a key trading partner. I think we should expect to see much more competition from the U.S. and other like-minded nations.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Lynch. It's a fascinating country, and there will be a lot to keep an eye on in the coming years.
It certainly is a historic time for Guyana, Karen. It's a country to watch. Thank you very much.
That was Ambassador Sarah Ann Lynch, an independent consultant and senior advisor at Dinamica Americas. She's a former ambassador to Guyana who also served as the Secretary of State's representative to CARICOM. Next up, Dr. Francisco Monaldi of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy talks with ASCOA Online's Kalia Robertson. He lays out the energy trajectory for Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, as well as what the vacuum left by PetroCaribe's collapse means for the Caribbean.
Thank you for joining us today on Latin America in Focus. So we're going to talk about these three Caribbean countries, Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, that all have an oil and gas sector, but are all at different stages of their journey in this sector. I want to begin with, let's call it the region's Cinderella story, Guyana. Within 10 years, it's transformed into this energy powerhouse that could soon be producing 1 billion barrels of oil a day. So can you put into context for us the scale and speed of Guyana's oil and gas development since 2015?
Yeah, sure. As you point out, an unbelievable story. And this is a country that was one of the poorest in the region, discovered oil in 2015, started production in 2019, and just 6 years later now is producing more than 700,000 barrels per day, and it's going to produce more than 1 million barrels, possibly double what it's producing now by 2030, or potentially even more, because they have been finding more oil and being faster in developing than expected originally. So an unbelievable story. It's a country, of course, that has a small population of a little bit more than 800,000 people. And because of that small population and such a large oil production, is already the largest oil producer per capita in the world, surpassing countries like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, or the United Arab Emirates. So it's a pretty amazing story. Of course, it was the country with the highest growth rate of GDP for the last couple of years. And it's a very interesting, also political story, and one that I think will give us a lot of interesting elements to study for a long time.
And so you mentioned countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, but within the context of Latin America, where does Guyana fall among the region's oil and gas producers?
Sure. In terms of actual production, of course, the largest producer in Latin America is Brazil, followed by Mexico, and then you have Venezuela. And after Venezuela, you have a few countries that are relatively close, but Guyana is the next one. Argentina is also very close. So it's quite remarkable that a country like Venezuela, that has one of the largest resource endowments on earth, Guyana is close to reaching Venezuelan levels of production.
Wow, that's incredible. And within 6 years of production?
Exactly.
So right next to Guyana is Suriname. It's preparing for its own oil boom. Around 2.5 billion barrels of oil have been discovered since 2019, and first oil is expected in 2028. Now, one difference I noticed is that with Suriname, we see a longer lead time, about 10 years as compared to Guyana's 4 years. Should we have different expectations for how Suriname's hydrocarbon sector should develop?
Well, the discovery in Suriname was much less clear in terms of the size of reserves, and the company, particularly Total, which leads the consortium, wanted to make sure of the size of the discovery and of the potential profitability of the discovery before actually committing to developing it. Now they have committed, and they are going to invest about $10 billion, which is twice the GDP of Suriname. So it's a pretty significant investment, but we're talking about much less production so far than what we're expecting in Guyana. We're talking about Suriname producing about 200,000 barrels from this field when they reach its full production. And so it has had significant delays, but now, as you pointed out, first production is expected in 2028. The population of Suriname is slightly smaller than the one in Guyana. So in per capita terms, it's going to be significantly less. And Suriname is starting from a very difficult economic situation with a significant debt. In fact, that's why the government lost their recent elections. And so in that sense, for Suriname, this is a much more significant change of the situation, because they were in a very problematic negative trajectory, and this is going to help them very much.
So on the flip side of this oil boom in the Southern Caribbean, we have another country, Trinidad and Tobago, that's in a downswing in its energy production and export. Oil production has declined significantly since its heyday in the 70s and 80s, and then gas followed the same trajectory over the last decade or so, with some estimates suggesting that reserves could run out within 5 or 10 years. Do you think Guyana and Suriname are maybe looking to Trinidad and Tobago as a country from which they can draw lessons for how to manage their own oil and gas windfall?
Some good lessons and some negative lessons, as usually the case. Notice that Trinidad was a pioneer in the region because it was the first country to really develop LNG exports and became a LNG powerhouse. And not only that, but Trinidad was able to use their natural gas resources to develop petrochemicals, aluminum, other energy-intensive sectors. And that really made them have a very good performance for a long time. But as you point out, after reaching more than 6% of the world exports of LNG, they have significantly declined. LNG exports are about half of what they were at its peak, and natural gas production about 40-something% less. And part of the reason is that this happens to many oil-producing countries, that they do not keep up with doing investments for exploration to find additional resources. And this takes so long, sometimes a decade, that you cannot rest in your laurels. You really need to keep exploring and finding new resources. Of course, at some point, resources are finite, and that's also a lesson that other countries in the region need to keep in mind. And by the way, now we have the additional challenge of of the energy transition. So it's not just if your resources are plentiful or not, it's also if the demand is going to be there in the future. But having said that, I think for a while, Trinidad was an example of a really well-managed resource sector compared to other countries in the region. To give you an example, Venezuela has as much or more gas than Trinidad surrounding Trinidad and hasn't exported one molecule of gas, which is pretty amazing. And in the rest of the region, there's only one other country that exports LNG, which is Peru. And so, for example, Argentina, with massive resources, has not been able to develop that. So we have to give a lot of credit to Trinidad. Having said that, they are trying to get some new investments going. And they, of course, also are trying to get exploration happening. And they did an auctioning of blocks. Unfortunately, it was not very successful. Only a few were picked up by CNOOC, the Chinese national company. But they did separately a big deal with Exxon that could open up the exploration in deep waters, because so far Trinidad has mostly produced oil in shallower water. So, and if that develops, that will be important. And finally, we can discuss it later, but the other big opportunity, of course, is that if at some point the conditions are met for Venezuela to export their gas through Trinidad, which of course today faces a lot of obstacles. But if that happens, Trinidad might avert the continued decline.
So you touched on a lot of points that we're hopefully going to get further into. In the past, Venezuela played a huge role in Caribbean energy security, especially within the CARICOM nations, but also some Central American nations through Petrocaribe, which was founded by the Chavez government, and sold cut-price oil with preferential credit agreements to these smaller countries in the region. Now, the deal has mostly fallen apart since 2019. There was a push a few years ago to try to revive it, but that would require the lifting of some U.S. sanctions and a change of conditions in Venezuela, as you said. So in the context of Venezuela no longer being this provider of oil and gas for the smaller countries in the region, how have they managed to fill this vacuum, fill this gap of energy supply?
Well, this has been really tough because a lot of the Caribbean nations depend on oil or oil products to produce electricity, which is typically not what countries do anymore. Oil is rarely used to produce electricity, but in the Caribbean, because of the fact that they don't have the resource, but also it's not easy to get other alternatives, they have relied on it. And of course, also on imported LNG. And both of those, oil and its derivative, like the diesel and LNG prices, have gone up significantly. Of course, it's a very volatile, which is also a challenge because even it goes up is bad, but the volatility itself, it's a big problem for these nations because how do you plan ahead for this? And so definitely the loss of Petrocaribe and, in the past, even before Chavez, Venezuela had less generous, but had some types of programs to help Caribbean islands. And the fact that, PDVSA, the national company, went broke basically in 2014 when the price of oil declined, production really collapsed, and refining also collapsed, which is also a problem because many countries in the Caribbean do not have refineries and they relied on refined products from Venezuela. And Venezuela basically had to give back the refineries that it had in partnership in the Dominican Republic, in Jamaica, and in Cuba. So all that fell apart, and it's not easy to reconstruct because today Venezuela is refining a fraction of what they used to refine, and is producing significantly less than half of what they used to produce. On top of that, as you mentioned, U.S. sanctions make it hard for Venezuela to even sell the oil that it does produce. Currently, they can export a little bit to the U.S. through a Chevron's license. Is the only one remaining that was reinstated recently, but most of the oil it's sold in the black market in China, so the government doesn't get much revenue. So even though Maduro from time to time tries to resurface the idea because he wants, of course, the support of the CARICOM nations in the OAS and in other international forums, the fact is that he cannot deliver. And so these countries basically have to buy oil at market prices. Cuba is getting a little bit of support from Mexico, but the CARICOM countries do not have anything similar. So there have been a lot of discussions about potentially either building a pipeline from Trinidad to some of these countries and getting the gas of even Guyana, but that's very costly. And of course, Trinidad today, production is declining, so it doesn't make sense. So it's going to continue to be a challenging time for Caribbean countries relying on fossil fuels.
You mentioned that Suriname has a state-owned oil company in place. Guyana's situation is a little bit different. So I want to maybe talk about this public-private sector balance that we see play out a lot in the region. And I want to bring it up specifically in the context that in Guyana's recent election, the production sharing agreement that they have with the consortium of oil producers was a point of contention among the opposition candidates. There were accusations that as the deal stands, the 2016 deal that is for the Starbreak block, the state is maybe not reaping the proportion of benefits that it could be. Can you explain a little bit about that deal and what that tells us about how Guyana is approaching its relationship with the private sector in developing its oil and gas industry?
Sure. So in the region, national companies are typically dominant, are the main players in all the major oil producers. In Guyana, they have never created a state-owned company. There has been talk about it over the years. I think that the problem with national oil companies is that they sometimes put a limit on the fast development of the sector because they either have to put money in order to be partners, and that could slow down because they sometimes have difficulties putting the money. And the other thing is that if they want to have a bigger role, like operational role, for example, they typically do not have the capacity to be involved in such sophisticated projects as deep water projects. So it's interesting because the fact that Exxon, one of the biggest and more effective companies in the world, has been able to develop these resources so fast shows the benefits of having 100% private participation in developing these fields. The flip coin is, as you point out, there are some complaints about the government take over the contract, meaning how much of the profits are kept by the government, particularly in the short run. In the sort of longer run, after Exxon recovers their investment, they will get a significantly bigger share over the life of the project. But at the beginning, it's relatively more modest, and there are so many expectations among the population of benefiting. Imagine hearing my friends in Guyana sometimes tell me, oh, please do not say that we have the largest oil production per capita in the world, because the population thinks that we should be then like Abu Dhabi. And how come still there is a significant proportion of the population in poverty, etc.? So this is not going to happen that fast. But another thing that you have to keep in mind is the following. The risk of exploration in Guyana were very high. All the previous oil wells drilled had been not successful. Whenever you have a situation like that, governments have to offer a deal that is relatively attractive to companies in order to invest. But of course, if a good surprise materializes, like in this case, discovering 11 billion barrels of oil is something that was a very low probability beforehand. So now, of course, people, even the government and opposition politicians, are dissatisfied that they do not get a bigger share. And this has been part of the political discussion. Interestingly, typically those who are in the opposition are the ones saying, we want to renegotiate the contract. But once you get in power, you evaluate things and you see, well, there are billions of dollars in line of new investment that might be delayed if we start a forceful renegotiation of these. We typically can do things in the margin, but if you change the contract, it's a pretty bad signal for the existing consortium. So they have decided to increase the government taking new projects in the new contracts, but so far have kept, not everything, but most of the big features of the contract are the same. But as you also pointed out in the previous election, we had the two opposition groups talking about different versions of a potential renegotiation because, of course, they were trying to use the dissatisfaction of the population on the pace of benefiting from the oil. So the country has to figure out a way to really make sure that they do things in a proper way to avoid falling on the resource trap or resource curse or all these phenomena that have been a problem in some other countries, including, of course, neighboring Venezuela.
Of course, yeah. And thinking ahead about this transition to cleaner energies, we've seen in the last couple of years that there's been a boom in investment in the oil and gas industry in Latin America and the Caribbean. I read in a report recently that 2024, there was the largest investment in a decade in Latin America and the Caribbean, of course in Guyana, but also in places like Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. And there's still interest in what else there could be in this section of the Caribbean. So all this happening while we're talking about energy transition using cleaner energies, renewable energies, And while Suriname and Guyana, it's important to note, are Amazonian territories and promote the country as a carbon sink, as a leader in environmental conservation in the region. So, is there a future where, because of these shifts in the global energy matrix and promotion of the energy transition, that fossil fuel supply outstrips demand? And if so, how can these countries balance these changes?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, a very different, interesting challenge. As you point out, for example, current Vice President Jack Deo, when he was president, one of his big issues was precisely making Guyana a leader in climate policy and in decarbonization and talking about Guyana as a carbon sink. Then, of course, they discovered this massive resource and they have faced some criticism about being hypocritical because now they're going to produce much more oil. And there was, I don't know if you saw the famous interchange of President Ali in the BBC complaining that the rich countries are telling Guyana what to do. And of course, Guyana has to develop its potential for the benefit of its citizens. I think they have a very good claim to argue that they should for a variety of reasons. But one very pragmatic one is the following. Guyana has very low carbon intensity per barrel produced compared to the world average. And as a result, any oil that they do not produce is going to be produced by another producer that has higher impact in climate. So it's not that they producing less will necessarily benefit climate issues. Suriname has a similar claim. That would be, for example, very different from the case of Venezuela, which has extra heavy oil, or Canada, right? So they have a rationale for arguing that they are the least problematic option to develop oil resources. On top of that, of course, they can argue that they could use part of the resources coming out of the oil production in order to work on other areas that are very impactful in terms of being a carbon sink, etc., even potentially doing also carbon capture in their oil facilities. So having so much resources coming from oil could benefit in net terms significantly by working on those areas. By the way, that's the type of policies that President Lula in Brazil is advocating, fully developing the oil resources, but at the same time, setting aside some of those resources for reducing emissions in land management, deforestation, and the like. But having said that, of course, at some point, you can face either of two things. One, a peak in oil demand and a decline in the oil price to a point in which revenues significantly decrease. By the way, by that time, if it's relatively soon, Guyana has the advantage that their cost will be pretty competitive, and so they will make much less money, but they will probably continue to produce. But that is certainly a potential challenge if it happens very fast. But there is another scenario in which oil demand continues to be relatively high and Guyanese oil will be demanded and the price would be attractive, but in which they run out of their oil because the current 11 billion barrels will allow them to increase production for less than a decade and then it will start declining. So the country has to really learn from other experiences of other countries, including Trinidad next door, about how to manage oil wealth in a way that once they face those scenarios, the country is not so dependent on just oil that it enters into a crisis. And that is not easy at all. One positive thing about Guyana is that they seem to really have been seeking advice from the world on precisely these issues. And I think for the most part so far, they have not made the bigger mistakes that other countries have made. But of course, we are at a very early stage, so still not clear.
Well, thank you very much, Francisco, for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Karin Zessis. This episode was produced by our associate producer, Kalia Robertson. Luisa Lemmy is our executive producer. Check out the podcast notes for links to better understand Guyana's recent election and energy context, as well as for a link to a prior interview with Dr. Monaldi focused on Venezuela. You can find other episodes of Latin American Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast or write us an email telling us what you think at latinfocus@as-coa.org. Share, write us a review, and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music in the podcast was performed for America Society. Find out about upcoming concerts at musicoftheamericas.org. And if you like the soundtrack in this episode, consider becoming an America Society member for preferential access to all performances at 680 Park Avenue in New York, as well as art exhibitions, book talks, and more exciting events. Get the link in our show notes to learn more. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. Thank you.